Hello and welcome to Take a Beat. This is episode 23 and we want to invite you to get comfortable because we're going to talk about uncomfortable conversations. My name is Tirza and I'm the digital pastor here at IES, and I am here with Pastor Mike Rody, executive pastor at IES.
And king of the uncomfortable.
Why so?
Just seems to be.
Well, during our live Q&A a couple months back, there were lots and lots of questions, and so we took all of them and we just kind of browsed through them to see what the congregation wanted to know about. And there were quite a number of questions about how do you talk to your kids about this? When is the right time to talk to your kids about this? Like one of them, let's start with this one. When do you think is the right time to introduce your children to sex? How should we start talking about it in a biblical way?
I like the last half of that. I don't so much like the first half of that question. But there's two kinds of kids. There's kids that ask questions, and there's kids that let their parents think that they're totally cloistered and have no idea what's going on. And so the kids that ask questions, you answer the questions as they come. And in the household I grew up in, my sister was always asking about babies and where they came from. And eventually my mom just decided on a long drive to somewhere that she would just tell us how it all worked. And I think that was, for the most part, pretty good. I was a few years younger than my sister, but you know, we knew how it worked. We knew from the perspective of what was being asked. And my sister was always asking those questions in front of me, so it wasn't something I wasn't thinking about. And that brings us a good point. Some parents feel like, oh, you know, I'm protected my kids. They don't know anything about this. What's funny is what I found is kids understand their parents.
Yeah.
And if their parents are trying to keep them cloistered and protected from these things, they will let their parents think that they're cloistered and protected from these things. But if your kids have older siblings, if your kids have friends with older siblings, if your kids have older cousins, they're exposed to a lot of things that you might not realize, just because kids talk about what they know.
Yeah.
And kids get excited when they know new things. And they like to use words that they don't even necessarily understand what they are. And so what's running around at school or with the cousins or with the neighbors or relatives, there's a lot of times where parents think their kids don't know anything. So what's a good time to talk about sex? Start early and have small conversations.
But you don't want a huge talk about sex.
No, usually when people wait for the huge talk, they usually waited a few years too long.
Also, I feel like it's like little bite-sized awkwardness is better than a huge chunk of awkward all at once.
Yeah, so a few years ago, we did this thing we called Summer Bible Challenge in the church we pastored in the States. And one of the ladies, who was a very prim and proper Dutch gal from down the road, came up to me after about 2 weeks of reading through Genesis. And she says, Pastor Mike, there's so much sex in the Bible. And I was like, yeah, well, I guess so. Yeah. You know, she's trying to read the whole Bible through in 90 days. So she's really reading a lot of the Bible. And yeah, so for us, with our kids, we had them start reading the Bible when they're about 8, and we started them in the New Testament, but eventually they get to the Old Testament where there is a lot of discussion about sex.
Just Genesis.
And I remember the day when my oldest came up to me and said, Dad, what's rape? You know, it's like, oh, that was, but we'd already had a few minor conversations along the way about reproduction and stuff. And if you're asking your kids on the level of which they're at, if you're answering on the level at which they're asking, it's very easy. If you suddenly think you have to tell the entire thing with all the, you know, then that's a lot harder.
Yeah, no, when you were saying about that, I just have this flashback to not too long ago. There was the teens did a soap at my place. I wasn't hosting it, Titus was. But one of the boys, it was Genesis, because the church is reading through Genesis. And then this boy, 11 at the time, he just spoke up like, what is, like, what was, I think, testicles? No? Foreskin?
Foreskin, yeah, probably about circumcision.
Yes.
You know, that does bring up some discussion
circumcision.
topics.
And so I was there and I was like, oh, ask your teens pastor. I'm no longer the teens pastor. Ask Josh.
Oh. So, you know, the Bible doesn't hide these things.
No.
And so I think the unfortunate thing is for a lot of Christians, they think they can't talk about them, but the Bible talks about them. So if you're really uncomfortable talking about them, doing it in the course of reading through the Bible with your kids or something is really a good way to do it, because you can do it in small chunks as they're interested. There's this great joke, and I've used this before, so if you've heard this before, I apologize, but this little girl walks up to her mom in the kitchen one day and says, "Mom, what is virgin?" And the mom's like, uh-oh, my daughter is at the age. I need to figure this out real quick. I got to discuss plumbing, and I've got to discuss body parts, and I got to come up with all these things. And just as the mom is like starting to perspire and stress out about this, the daughter points up on the shelf, "Virgin oil?" And so what I always tell parents is, if your kids are asking questions, then ask them what they understand first. Because there's no point in telling them more than they need to know. But if they're asking a question, what is foreskin? Well, what do you think it is? You know, and then go from there. You get a perspective. Oh, I was reading, and this is okay. Then you can figure out how to explain it without giving information overload.
Yeah. But I think information overload is also overwhelming for the children.
Yeah.
When did you start having the little conversations with your kids? Because you have 2 boys, all grown now.
You know, ours were a lot of little conversations, and it's hard to like pin down exactly. We had talked a little about where babies come from when they were younger, and then when they started reading the Bible, we had those discussions. When my eldest said, "What's rape?" you know, then we had a pretty open discussion about the proper time for sexual activity and respecting sex and things like that. And I don't remember if he was 9 or 10, but you know, he was pretty young. And then also we talk about it related to when so-and-so suddenly is pregnant and not married. And, you know, those are good times to talk with kids about such things.
I think that's when my parents had like the conversation that most notable to me was when someone we're related to suddenly got pregnant.
Yeah. No, and actually I think those are good things. We don't have to evaluate the person as bad or good.
No.
But what we can do is we can talk about how it comes about and what is God's plan.
Yeah.
Or what does God intend? What does he hope for?
And I think sometimes as adults, I'm not married, I don't have kids, but I've pastored teenagers. But sometimes the conversations that we have with kids and teens, it's not just the plumbing and how it works, but it's also about value, right? About how, okay, this is how you treat females, and this is how you treat males, like how to respect others, how to be understanding or gracious with differences.
A great talk to have with kids early and often is about that life isn't about sex. Unfortunately, our culture would tell us that that sex is what determines our personal value, our personal acronym or whatever. The fact of the matter is, God designed sex to be a component of marriage as a way for a husband and wife to be connected with one another. And when we see it outside of marriage, we see problems and difficulties. And in fact, some of the people watching will probably have had an experience of sex outside of marriage, and they realize even today for themselves, it impacts them in a negative way. And so some parents say, well, how can I talk to my kids about this when I did all these things? And my line is, well, you talk about that these are things that were destructive for you, and you want to help them make better choices in life and teach them to think. That's a big thing for me, is I wanted my kids to learn how to think, not just know what to do. So I can tell my kids what to do. Don't touch that. And I can watch them automatically go, not supposed to touch it. I should test it and see why I shouldn't touch it. And that's how kids are, and that's how we are as adults too. So, it's good to know the why.
And I experienced that in my life being parented by my parents. My mom was a pastor's kid, and so she was always doing the right thing. My dad wasn't, and he had all sorts of things before, experimented with stuff. And so growing up, when I was little, it was always the no dating. And that was from my dad. But then as I grew older and could have conversations, my parents actually told me some of the context of my dad's past and how the impact of it, how he what he ended up struggling with, and different things and consequences and things that they needed to process. Not into details. Sure. I also don't want to know details.
Yeah, you don't want to know all the details of your parents' sex life. That's for sure.
But they talk about how he had to process through all of these things. And context matters. Context helps. Yeah. Because even if you have done all of these different things and you've made your share of life choices, but I think being able to share that with your kids, your teens, and talking about consequences and impact and different things, I think that would help.
Very important. I know a lot of dads who were totally unrestrained as kids in areas of sex. And when they raise their daughters, they're so afraid of what can happen, and they're so afraid to talk about their choices, and they're so strong about the no dating. But if they will break down and say, I have experience with this. Yeah. This is the way that I thought as a young man. Yeah. And a girl might have perceived it one way, but I perceived it another way. And helping, I think one of the things that young women really don't grasp in our modern culture is the significant difference between how guys think regarding sex, or regarding relationships, regarding all those kinds of things, and how they think. Yeah. And a lot of young women, and when I mean young women, I mean anyone who's not even married yet, just don't understand the significance that sex has in terms of men's minds. And so I think it's good to communicate between a husband and wife. It's good to communicate to kids. I think some parents need to talk to their daughters about what they wear out in public, because 50-year-old men might be ogling them, and that just sounds gross. But those are discussions that if you don't have it, then out of naivete, someone puts themselves in a really awkward situation.
Yeah, and that was kind of the dynamic of my parents. My dad was like, no dating until you're in college. And my mom was more of the context, let me explain. She was also the one who had the plumbing conversation with me. She brought out
That's good.
the biology textbook because she was a biology teacher. So I got the Latin terms for things and the proper terms for things. That was my mother. So between my parents, they actually like ended up giving me the context of it, and my dad ended up sharing a little bit more about his experience and his point of view. So that was really good for me, but I understand where you're coming from, what you're saying.
And back to your very first question, what's the appropriate time? You and Pastor Anthony and I went to a school one time. This was a secular school.
Whew, that was one of the most interesting pastoral experiences.
And we had the opportunity because the teachers in that school were so uncomfortable to talk about sex in front of their, was it 5th and 6th graders, I think?
Yeah.
And in the end, the 5th and 6th graders were asking all kinds of questions that were showing me that they've watched way too much pornography.
Yeah.
It was very clear that their goal was to embarrass us and boost their prestige among their friends. And if that's going on in that setting, then I'm sure it's going on in any other setting of any other kids in that age group. And you want your kids to hear it from you before they hear it from those kids.
Yeah, that experience was awkward for me, not because like the conversations are awkward. I've had that conversation with teens all the time. It's the being put on a panel in front of these kids and then seeing the questions. And I was like, oh, wow, we're just put on the spot.
And it was funny because the teachers, these are professional teachers, were melting in the background because they were so uncomfortable with the topic. And it just goes to show that, you know, we need to find a way to wisely deal with this with our kids. And it's a whole lot easier to do it in a one-on-one conversation or a small family conversation rather than in an open gymnasium with a whole bunch of kids.
And it's not only in a secular school, because for a while I adjunct taught at a Christian school. And that was happening as well. Maybe not as blatantly because it's a Christian school, it's happening in the background. But since I was like close to the teens, I heard comments and stuff from them, and we know that those things are like they're looking and talking about porn. Don't know why you talk about it, but okay. But
and you know, we also realize that sometimes at that age kids talk about it even though they have no idea what they're talking about.
Yeah.
But wouldn't it be better for you to be able to tell your kids what they need to know and how to appropriately assess it, how to walk away from it, how to not be engaged in it, and why not to be engaged in it, so that they can say, hey, I'm not going to be a part of this discussion, and they can move on because they know it's good for them.
So earlier you were talking about, you know, acronyms and stuff. That's one of the other questions that came up in the live Q&A is how early should we start to have conversations about the LGBTQ
plus question mark,
yes.
question mark, question.
And like one of the other, there are tons of questions about this during the live Q&A. And the other one says, it seems that today LGBTQ influence growing larger, even in cartoons. Like, how do I talk to my kids about it?
I think there's a lot packaged there. For one, it's a very media-driven discussion item. And it's the hot topic in Western media and not just American media. Thank goodness it's not just my country, but it's all over the place. And so it is a topic, and it is a topic your kids have heard about, I guarantee. I mean, if they're in school, they've heard about it. If they're around older kids, they've heard about it.
Yeah.
And so don't assume that they don't know what it is. What you might need to find out is how much they know about it. They might just know that it's an acronym assigned to a group of people. They might not even know what the L and all the other things stand for. On the other hand, are there things in media? Yeah, there's lots of terrible things in media. In fact, there's a lot of things that is in children's, quote unquote, children's programming that should be out and out rejected by Christians.
Yeah.
And so managing what our kids see is always a top priority. And in fact, in relation to that, even just sitting down with a phone and YouTube and watching them not watch videos, but watch the first 10 seconds of 100 videos, it shows that there's some unhealthy things related to media there. So you need to know what your kids are watching. You need to be able to have conversations about it. You need to know what they're thinking about it, and are they assessing it? And as a parent, your role is to lead your children. And I think that's different than protecting your children.
Yeah.
Leading is better, because leading is going to include protecting your children, but leading is also going to teach them and train them to be aware of the circumstances around them.
Yeah.
Some people want to cut their kids off from everything, and their kids will just let them think they've been cut off from everything, but when they're not, they'll just go do whatever else. I won't tell any stories, but I have.
Let's not tell stories. And I think I love that differentiation between protecting and leading, because leading has this element of introducing, not just for yourself, but for your kids, the idea of wisdom, to know what is going on and what, like, the situation or the facts, and then understanding how we interact with it, how we respond to it, how we live in a world that has different values.
Yeah. And that's important, because we may be concerned about this one issue, but there's 1,000 other issues.
Yeah.
So when I was a little kid, drugs were just suddenly an issue. It was the early 70s, and we had hippies wandering through our neighborhood occasionally, and we knew that people went off to this one empty lot in the bushes and disappeared, and then came out kind of in weird attitudes, and so my parents, particularly my mom, would say, would talk about what they're doing and how it's unfortunate for them. And I always like, when I look back, how my mom dealt with it. She didn't do it in any way that was particularly judgmental towards those young people. But what she did do is help us understand that it was not helping them, and it was not good for them, but that it was also an open discussion for us. Did the same thing with people who got pregnant without having been married, and in our family it was pretty much a discussion occasionally, because my parents worked with a lot of teenagers, a lot of young people, a lot of college students, and so we would often have these discussions about, hey, we overheard some discussion, and my mom would help us frame the values and frame the outcomes. My dad also, though.
And I think with especially this topic, a lot of the times Christian parents are so afraid that this is going to somehow permeate to their family, that their attitude becomes a little bit more offensive and ends up being maybe judgmental of people who are in the LGBTQ community.
And we see that even in our own church, where there are some people who are so afraid, and out of fear, they want to cut people off.
Yeah.
And what I would like to see is that out of confidence in God, we care for people. We don't necessarily accept their activity. We don't accept their sin, Just like we don't accept adultery,
Or gossip.
we don't accept gossip. Yeah, we don't accept being a jerk or mean or arrogance. There's a lot of things we can't accept in terms of sin, but we still value the people and want to see them draw close to God.
Yeah.
And we do hold people accountable. We need to hold people accountable. But, you know, a lot of people have a background, and their background influences how they function today. And so if they are committed to following Christ and growing in Christ, then we need to be supportive of that, and we need to help our kids understand maybe how did they get to where they are, and how do I keep from having those issues in my life? How do I honor God so that I can have a healthy life?
Yeah. Yeah.
Because we want to leave the door open for, if by chance our kids have an issue, they can come back and say, I need Jesus. Because if we've shut everybody off that's not just the way we think they should be, then we will end up in a situation where our kid can't climb back up on the wagon with Jesus and keep moving forward.
Yeah, I mean, I think families, and even I think the household of God, this family, needs to be a psychologically safe place for people to talk about these things, for people who are struggling to come and be welcomed, for anyone to come and be welcomed.
Yeah. Actually, that's a great point, because it used to be very common for my social circle as a kid to use, to call people names. And they were names that would be referenced to LGBTQ kind of activities as put downs or whatever. And what I saw growing up is that, and I've definitely seen it as a pastor, is that there's a number of people that I knew that at a certain time in life, maybe were questioning some of those sexuality issues. And it wasn't something weird in them. It was just part of their mental development process. And they might not have been in the middle of the bell curve, but they weren't that far off. But they were dealing with issues. And if we're treating people poorly, or we're using names, calling people names, then we're saying there's no room for you to work through this issue. And young people, especially in that middle school age, late elementary school for girls particularly, often have these things that they're working through, and it's just part of the mental development. And unfortunately, a lot of culture has said, oh, if you feel this way, you should just follow it. Well, actually, we know better than that. In fact, psychology itself will tell us, if you're angry, just letting out your anger just makes you more angry. So a lot of times, those emotional things, we need to bring them under self-control. And that's what the Bible tells us all the time. So we help people do that as a church, and we help our kids process through that as parents. And self-control is a big part of that.
Now, one of the things that came to mind, this is unrelated to the sex talk or LGBTQ, but growing up, my parents were pastors, and so they would, I'm an only child, but I've had a house full of people, always like staying there to learn ministry from my parents or whatever it is. At some point, we had 13 people in the house. And there was one point when I think we had 13 people in the house. One of them, he wasn't fresh out of prison, but he probably a couple years before, he just got out of prison for killing someone. And he wanted to study to serve the Lord. And my parents took him in, and they're even gave him a place to stay. And so people asked them, like, you have a teenage daughter in your house. Why do you let this person in? I'm like, the wing where I was, like, our family was staying and where he was staying was, like, everyone else was staying was different. But people ask my parents that, and my parents always had conversations with me about it, and they make sure that there are boundaries and things like that. But having lived through my parents serving other people that way, I think it gave me a better understanding of what it means to love people, what it means to serve people. I think we don't care where you've been, we care where you're going. Once I came to IES, it just clicks for me because my parents was that way. So I think I know we were talking about like difficult conversations, but I think having conversations with our kids and modeling how we value and how we are confident in our faith, and we are, wise in making decisions with boundaries and talking about boundaries and things like that. But we model how we are to love and accept and celebrate people and meet people where they're at. Like, we modeled them to our kids.
Yep. Modeling is really what we do, and what we've got to realize is when we model fear, when we model hate, when we model apathy, our kids are picking that up too.
Yeah.
So you can't go with the old do what I say, not what I do. It just doesn't work well.
Yeah.
Now, there are kids who will pick it up and go, I don't want to be like my parents. But I don't think you want your kids to be like that. You want your kids to want to be like you because you're doing the best you can.
Yeah. And
you want them to be even better than that. I would like my kids to be a lot like my wife and I, and even better than my wife and I. And we always pray that our kids will be able to stand up on our shoulders and not just muddle through like us.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, I think that's the time that we have, but thank you so much, Pastor Mike, for having this conversation. And so we invite you to think about what we've been talking about. If you have any comments or questions, feel free to put it in the comment section or talk to us directly. And we are also, IES Online is also on social media. We're on Instagram and Facebook. We're also, we have an online community that you can be a part of, but we would love to connect with you. Anyways, thank you so much for joining us, and we will see you next time on Take a Beat.